Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. On today's episode, we'll be continuing our Reading Revolution series discussion of Angela Davis's Abolition Democracy. If you haven't already listened to part 1, please be sure to check it out wherever you get your podcasts. Just be sure to search for LeftPOC. And also get your free copy of the book on our Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/leftpoc, where all of our content is 100% free. On that note, you can also make a donation there of $1 or more to help us keep the project going. We always want to not only keep everything free, but also to be able to continue paying those involved a fair wage for their labor and to continue supporting other podcasts and projects that are doing important work. Also, follow us on social media. Again, that's LeftPOC. And be sure to leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps others find and enjoy the podcast. With all that said, let's get on with the show. Hi everyone, it's Wendy Muse. I'm here with my co-host Richard. What's up?
Hello, welcome.
Yeah. Welcome to everyone. We today are going to continue with our discussion of the set of interviews with Angela Davis called Abolition Democracy. This is part 2, and we only have a few bits to discuss today, so it's going to be a little bit shorter than the last episode where we did like a more or less comprehensive breakdown of most of the things she discusses in the text. Today we're going to talk about 3 specific things. 2 things that are in the text itself, and then the other third item is sort of like, outside of what she discusses, but that still links back to some of the themes that she brings up throughout the book. The first of these is her sort of comparative analysis of approaches to enslavement and imprisonment by both Douglass and Du Bois, so Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, and sort of the debate that they were having in real time, and the ways that her own sort of political upbringing has made her reflect on their political and ideological interventions. And then also we're going to talk about her discussion of the misuse of identity politics. It's worth remembering that this is during the Bush administration that she's reflecting on the Bush administration. And so there was a lot of misuse of identity politics during that rainbow coalition of terror, of like international terror, basically run by that administration. And then finally, we're going to talk about some criticisms and maybe some, have sort of a critical view of where Angela Davis is now politically and sort of what that means. Of course, respectfully, because we love Angela around here. But we do this with all of our Reading Revolution episodes, where we definitely kind of not only discuss what's going on in the text, but also what's happening with the author, him or herself, their self, and where they are now, or were after they wrote what they did. So anyway, let's get started actually with the Douglass Du Bois breakdown that she discusses, or debate, I should say, not breakdown. They were okay. They didn't like fight it out with fisticuffs or anything. But yeah, what were your thoughts on that, Richard? And then I'll add in, some bits here and there.
I think it's kind of interesting as somebody who is, learning this stuff and beginning. I guess I've been at this for a couple years now, or at least a year. But as somebody still kind of getting a new awareness to a lot of this stuff, I hadn't really been too familiar with this juxtaposition, and other than some passing reading of Angela before, and the text itself. From Angela doesn't do so much, but the introduction mentions that based on prior writings and prior discussions, that this highlight of the difference that she sees between Du Bois and Douglass in the future of Black liberation is very critical to kind of the future writings that she would have, and go on to discuss about prison abolition. And so one of the things that kind of stuck out to me from the introduction portion of it was that essentially I saw it as Douglass representing a more kind of joining the democratic apparatuses as they were and finding liberation through the law, whereas Du Bois took a position that was much more critical of what essentially both he and Davis saw as a replacement for slavery, which was prison and carcerality and the forced labor that came out of that. And so that was kind of the main takeaway that I got. And then it goes, we'll continue, but I'll let you get in there, Wendy.
Yeah. So she actually, when she was imprisoned herself, Davis wrote about this sort of debate between the two men. And so we should definitely revisit that at some point, perhaps in a Reading Revolution episode, to discuss that. But I think it's fascinating because it brings up a lot of debates, like you said, that sort of parallel contemporary ones. And so you still have a lot of people who are like against what's happening in prisons, or who are against, like police violence, and particularly racialized police violence towards Black men and women. But I think that there is a disconnect sometimes, and I've seen a lot of people make this point. There's a disconnect between that versus actual abolition of prisons and what that means. And so in many ways, the debate between Du Bois, who was being more critical and analytical about what was going on post-slavery, right? Like post-enslavement, what was happening to Black people, and particularly at this point, Black men, in terms of being imprisoned and wrapped up by the state, caught up by the state, basically the state apparatus, that was just kind of replacing what enslavement had done, right? But then also, I think, so having read both Douglass and Du Bois, and like I appreciate both men for what they had to say in their time, and I think it's fascinating. But one point she also makes that I think is critical for us to think about is W.B. Du Bois's internationalism kind of took Douglass to a second place, a different place. So Douglass was primarily focused on like his own life and the life of enslaved peoples in America, in the United States of America, I should say. That was his focus as an abolitionist, and also the focus of his abolitionist peers. Whereas I think with Du Bois, he was looking very critically at what was going on in the United States and then connecting it to what was happening around the world, in terms of marginalized people and oppressed peoples in the U.S. versus the way that the U.S. dealt with the rest of the world, and particularly just our sort of like connection, or what he argued was a need to connect back with our African roots, and just like what's going on in general in Africa on a political front. And that's like when he became a communist and all these things, and went to live in Ghana, et cetera. So I think that there's kind of it's almost like Du Bois is less debating with Douglass as he is continuing a legacy of liberation, right? I don't want to characterize it as like a fight, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it is kind of like he's picking up where Douglass left off, and continuing it into a much broader field and like deeper discussion. One last thing I just wanted to add. I wondered, when reading this, and maybe Douglass touches on it in her larger essay on the two men's debate on this issue, but I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if Douglass was just like tired. You know what I mean? Like he himself was a slave. Mm-hmm. He was an abolitionist, after he ended up in, finding freedom for himself, basically. And then I know that his first wife had died. He remarried the woman he married. So his first wife was Black. And I don't know what her involvement with abolitionism was, but I think she was also an abolitionist. But then the second woman he married was white. So I'm sure he got a lot of shit for that, right? Like at that time, it was like completely different, much rougher, most likely to be in an interracial marriage. But then on top of that, she was also an abolitionist. But what's interesting to keep in mind about many white abolitionists at the time was that there was sort of, they didn't all believe in equality of Black people, right? So many of them believed in the end of enslavement and the practice of slavery, the institution of slavery, but they didn't necessarily want to share a house or a neighborhood or, like a system of institutions with Black people. So I think it also is kind of like worth considering what his involvement with abolitionists meant for what he said as well. You know what I mean? Like, could that have possibly influenced some of his potential radicalism? Could that have like dampened his radicalism in some way, for him to be less, I don't know, for him to not go as far as he could have gone, I guess I should say.
Yeah, and I think you raised some interesting points. I think the international perspective of Du Bois is definitely critical. And when I think back, I have read some of Reconstruction, and then from Du Bois, and then Douglas's autobiography. And from that reading, and then this reading and your commentary, it makes me think it's like I do see that kind of more personalized perspective from Douglas versus a more systemic analysis from Du Bois, particularly in the Reconstruction piece. And so, like, I also see the building on, and then some of what you're talking about of kind of how I could see just being Douglas kind of being why it would make sense from a personal perspective for him to adopt some of the views and hold some of the views that he does, with consideration for where he found himself personally, the circles he found himself in, and so on and so forth. Like you mentioned, marrying a white abolitionist and probably traveling in many white abolitionist circles, it would naturally become more amiable and acceptable within those circles to kind of adopt those positions, and they would also be prevalent, and there'd be a lot of factors contributing towards, I think, a desire to adopt those types of positions or advocate them. And I think Du Bois also is in a unique position historically to kind of offer a more systemic analysis, also seeing how some of these things had played out over time, and from a perspective of still being immersed in the society rather than kind of aloof from it in the kind of class way I think that Douglas eventually found himself in. If you consider where Douglas starts as, property of a white family, to eventually being seen as notoriously now how most people outside of Black liberation probably see him as Lincoln's friend. That's a very large class jump, and I think that it would only be it's reasonable to expect that the analysis or the perspective would adjust over that time.
Like the question is, was Douglas the Jay-Z of no, I'm just kidding. Is he the Jay-Z of the abolition movement? Questions for the week. I'm just kidding. No diss on Douglas. He was great, but
and probably a better rapper, but I'm not going to go there right now.
He had a much more difficult experience, which brings me though to the question of, like, again, not to kind of pontificate and act like, armchair psychiatrist or something with Douglas, but I also wonder if part of it has to do with the fact that, like, he was literally a slave, right? And I think for him, if you're looking at it from a perspective of someone who was a slave and then saying, okay, now people are getting imprisoned, it's the same thing. It's like part of a system of slavery. He's going to be like, what? Like, are you kidding me? Like, I was an actual slave. These are people who are free, and now they're getting caught up in the prison system. But, maybe they, like, part of me wonders if, like, he saw it as sort of not so much an extension of enslavement, but like a far lesser degree, because it was, I'm wondering, like, part of me wonders if he maybe made some arguments about choice or about criminality. Again, these are things that we can discuss if and when hopefully we read Davis's piece later on about this, because I'm sure she goes into this. But right now, just kind of educated guessing on it, I wonder if he was just like, my experience was so harrowing that I cannot compare it to anything else that happens to people when they are free. It's not quite the same thing, because, like, their children, for example, won't be born into imprisonment, right? Whereas if you're a slave, your child is born into slavery, or like your entire family is part of it. I think in a way that's slightly different from, or he would argue, I'm assuming as a slave, is slightly different from the prison system, as bad as it is. I don't think he would downplay it, but I sort of wonder if it's part of it too. Like, you can't like slavery being so bad that it's not comparable to these other things. Sort of like when we have, just really quickly, sort of like when you hear some people talk about, migrant labor and abuses of migrant laborers, and then they compare it to slavery. And sometimes people get upset because they're like, ultimately though, even though they're getting paid very little, they're still getting paid. And then even they're like, it's not generational and it's abusive, and people acknowledge that, but it's not the same thing as like permanent generational chattel slavery. And so sometimes people don't like the comparison or the use of the word slavery to talk about these things. So I wonder if it's sort of that too, like if he would have made some sort of argument based on personal experience and saying it's not not the same thing.
It's fair to say, in my opinion, based off of like what we do know historically about Douglas, that he would have been susceptible to arguments of meritocracy. I think, like,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess it's worth noting that we should mention, for one reason or another, that among slaves, Douglas also still had it pretty good
Oh yeah,
comparatively to other slaves of the
and he
time.
admits
Like,
that. He says
yeah,
that literally
he's
in
aware.
his own.
Yeah, and so like I felt like that, and we should mention that. But then
Mhm.
I think one of the aspects that you bring up, that I think is kind of critical, is how I think that there was a large portion of abolitionists whose main kind of quarrel with slavery wasn't so much kind of the horrificness of slavery in and of itself, but the concept that these people had done nothing to deserve it, that
Mhm.
that these innocent people were being enslaved for no other reason than the color of their skin, their generational heritage, and like they needed a system that provided them an explanation for why these people were in these circumstances.
Right.
And so like it wasn't so much about abolishing the circumstances, abolishing the forced labor or the really horrific nature of the kind of brutality of punishment, but making sure it was being dealt to the people that deserved it, and that
Right.
only the people that deserved it were getting it. And it's like, yes, these people are all savages, but some of them are the kind of savages that we can teach to, live, cope peacefully in our houses and serve us dinner. And some of them are the type that can only be outside and need to be, whipped and chained. Like,
Yeah.
and that was kind of the concept behind the delineation. And for some, I think more whatever centrist abolitionists of the time, that it wasn't so much about abolishing the horrific nature of slavery itself, but just kind of giving it a righteous justification. And so like beyond what I think they thought was failing at the time, biblical or based strictly on a kind of hierarchical white supremacy without consideration for the circumstances, which our Colonized and Colonizer book tells us, it's like, hey, there's this obvious conflict in front of them in which they're dependent on these people that they think are subservient or less quality to them. It's kind of this inherent contradiction of colonialism and the early US. And so I think this, what we see in the criminalization and carcerality mentality in this transition between slavery and the prison system, is a manifestation of that in many ways.
Oh, for sure. And I think this sort of moralization or moral argument has a lot of flaws precisely because of that, because you can't see the forest for the trees, like you can't see the system. You can see people as individuals who are good or bad, or the way individuals are treated as being good or bad, but not necessarily the system as a whole. And I think like this reminds me not only of what Davis says with regard to the way we think about imprisoned people, right? We think about them all as like, well, they committed a crime, so maybe, and it reminds me so much right now of the debates that not debates, but I should say rhetoric, like discussions of immigration and versus prison, right? And so you see again, and I say this as someone who supports both movements. So just to make that clear, because I know there's some people who are like, don't give a shit about immigrants and like only care about Black people in America and fill in the blank, right? I am not part of that camp. I think both abuses towards immigrants and imprisoned people in this country are bad and should be discussed. But I will say that there's sometimes, I think, in the rhetoric, a major flaw, because what I hear often is there's a creation of a kind of perfect immigrant, right? Even like it's funny because I even hear immigrants in the US discuss that this idea is hyper flawed and they wish it would go away. But this idea of sort of like the model citizen, or like the model potential citizen, the model immigrant, sort of like the model minority myth as well, but with all immigrants. So like this idea that they're all innocent and they're all, hardworking and fleeing for their lives in this abusive situation, and that they deserve to be here because they haven't done anything wrong. And I know that rhetoric is done, it's, kind of constructed that way primarily in opposition to the language of people like Trump and conservatives who say all immigrants are criminals, and the second they step foot in our country, they've engaged in a criminal act, which again is like ridiculous, right? But I think that this kind of rhetoric is what is put in contrast to the rhetoric that Davis discusses, is problematic with regard to how we think of people who are imprisoned, right? Because we say, oh, they all committed a crime, therefore they are not innocent, therefore they do not deserve the same kind of recognition of their humanity and whatever happens to them. So like we can look at internment camp basically of immigrants on the border and say, oh my God, look at how they're treating those children. It's atrocious. Look at how they're treating these adults. They're putting people in cages. They're not feeding and clothing them and whatever. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes the same people who can notice the failure to recognize the humanity of immigrants at the same time will ignore the humanity of imprisoned people precisely because the majority of them, in terms of, or not the majority, but the proportion of them that's being discussed is Black people. And Black people, as Angela argues, is sort of, it's like the Blackness part is already the sin. So you're seen as criminal no matter what. You know what I mean? Like even if it requires less of an interrogation of the system that turned you into a criminal, that criminalized your very existence. That's not what they criticize. They criticize the person. Again, it's down to the individual, right? And so they don't pick apart the system that turns random Black people walking down the street into criminals just for existing. They don't criticize that. They criticize the person who gets imprisoned. And so I think that like contrast is really, it feels very like real right now because we're seeing it in real time. You know, like it's like a contemporary issue to this day, I think, that can be sort of what she talks about, but the debate between Du Bois and Douglas can kind of be grafted on to our discussion and the ways we discuss immigrants versus imprisoned people, despite the fact that conditions in U.S. jails are some of the most, like, I don't even know. There's not an adjective for it. That's how bad it is, you know?
Yeah, it's like what I pull out of that, especially what it makes me think about, is how headlines regarding, you know, various incidents, how they change depending on the race of the perpetrator and also sometimes the social position, but that, you know, when it's a white victim, their innocence is always presumed. So that, like, it might get mentioned, but like when it's a white perpetrator, it's about, you know, what are the headline will contain things that allude to the circumstances that led to it. Whereas with Black perpetrators, it's often something about a criminal record, you know, it's
and
like,
even Black victims, right?
Yeah, and Black victims as well. Yeah, as we
Yeah.
saw, we've seen. And so it's, I think the criminalization of being Black and existing, and then we see it constantly, depending on, you know, where you're following on Twitter, but it's hard to avoid anymore, as, you know, Black people constantly being arrested, harassed, beaten, or killed for simply existing, you know, whether it's being on the phone in their own backyard or, you know, walking too quickly into an entrance of a building that they're not supposed to be in because they're Black, like, even though they may live there or whatever. And I think that kind of criminalization and then that justification gives people, like you said, it allows them to avoid analyzing the systemic aspects, because they're able to focus in on, well, what was it that made this person in this situation end up with this kind of outcome, versus why is this, what are the systemic issues leading to these kinds of things, rather than individual actions or perceptions that are leading to those things. And it becomes very frustrating, I think, for a lot of folks, just because I feel like a lot of these things, for people that are paying attention, it's like we notice, it's like, well, what are we going to do about it? You know, what are we going to change? How are we going to change it? And I think what in the writing, what we see from Davis talking about Du Bois is, like, Douglas talked about kind of a negative liberation, which was the abolition of slavery, but Du Bois takes us towards a more comprehensive and positive liberation that includes building new structures of liberation that address the both historic and current chasm between these classes of society, with Black people existing as second-class citizens, especially during that time when there was supposed to be this reconstruction. Davis mentions that the 40 acres and a mule isn't just a rumor, that it was according to a military order. And essentially what basically happened is the United States just didn't back it up. And what we end up seeing is, in a few short years, going from seeing Black elected officials in local municipalities and even some at the national level, to them rapidly being excluded from the political system through the carcerality and the mass incarceration of them, and then also a lack of resources to put them in a place where they can exist in society rather than be dependent on the same people that they were allegedly liberated from.
Right. There's a real, I mean, his Du Bois's some of his earlier work, like Souls of Black Folk, he really has a very thorough breakdown of Reconstruction and what happened, how it failed. We should maybe at some point read excerpts from his earlier works about slavery and Reconstruction and the aftermath, because they're very salient. Another thing I just wanted to add, and then we can transition to something else, because I know I'm still like going on about this, but I think the other part that I forgot to mention earlier, where I think we see in particular the fault lines and the problems with these like bifurcated ideas of who is innocent, who's not, like who's acceptable and who's not, is when we talk about Black immigrants. So one of the areas, like where because I was talking about like sort of the difference between rhetoric around immigration and immigration rights versus imprisoned people and abolition of prisons and what that means. It's a very interesting problem or like conundrum for Black immigrants, especially Black immigrants who have darker skin, because what you see is, for example, cities that will say things like, you know, we're a sanctuary city and blah, 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 blah. Like I remember this very distinctly, like when Trump was first elected, or at least when he started with all of his like anti-immigrant rhetoric, there was a big popping up of like sanctuary cities. But at the same time, these sanctuary cities were also pumping exorbitant amounts of money into their police forces. And some of them were saying, oh, the police are not going to work with ICE. You know, they're going to do their own thing and they're going to still try to protect these communities. It was like they were saying that the police would protect immigrant communities with little discussion or even acknowledgement of the fact that there are also Black immigrants. So like, how can you have a discussion about sanctuary? Sanctuary for whom? I mean, which immigrants are we talking about if Black immigrants are being antagonized by both ICE and the police, right? And often too, like many Latino immigrants. I mean, of course, there are Black Latino immigrants as well, but I should say stereotypical images of Latinos in the sense of like a brown person. They are also antagonized by both police and ICE. So it's a very strange, like, set of dichotomous images that people have in at least the politicians try to portray, you know, in their minds about who is to be protected, trusted, who is innocent, who is worth, again, this idea of worth, right? Worthiness to be in this country, and who's going to contribute to the community and to the workforce. All this kind of language that's very meritocratic and based on, again, like kind of myths about who the immigrant is and what immigration means to the United States. Whereas, of course, there's never an in-depth discussion of like, because whenever people say things like, the U.S. is a nation, America is a nation of immigrants. Okay, but what about like Native Americans, like indigenous people who were here, or like slaves who were brought here who definitely were not immigrants, that also very much built this country? And so it's kind of, I think, it's frustrating to see the way we still, and I think people, especially politicians, still speak in this manner that creates these very neatly separated categories that ignore overlap, and that also ignore the fact that like they're putting one group into the positive category based again on like mythic ideas of what immigration is, because for them immigration is mainly a white thing. You know what I mean? Like, because they think of themselves as like, we were the immigrants who made this country great or whatever. But for them, they're only thinking about white immigrants and they're not thinking about what preceded that. Whereas I think at the same time, there's a demonization of, and like a specific targeting of people that by the criminal, quote unquote, criminal justice system, that they don't want to touch on that subject, you know? And it's like they're pitting the two groups against one another, that I think is really dangerous, instead of they're recognizing how there's overlap. And I wonder, part of me wonders like how this rhetoric is going to play out in the future, because I know in the case of both the US and many Latin American countries, immigrants that were coming over from Europe and in many times encouraged and financially aided by the governments that were in power at the time from Europe. Part of me wonders if like there's going to be the same kind of language of, you know, these slaves, like because at the time it was like former slaves were portrayed as lazy, incompetent, that they didn't want to work, even though they were facing extreme discrimination in the job market, despite being rather skilled, usually more so than some of the white immigrants coming over. But then there's this contrast with them versus the quote unquote hardworking white immigrant who wants to have a job, who wants to do better for his family, who wants to make money and make this country what it is. I wonder if we're kind of witnessing a real time reiteration of that kind of rhetoric and what it's going to mean for solidarity movements that we need to be forging between these multiple groups, as opposed to seeing them as separate, non-overlapping entities, Anyway.
No, I think that those are all great points that you raised, and then even the kind of mythical good immigrant, even Trump will say, "Oh, we want the skilled ones." It's like, well, the reality is that once you get to if you actually get into the immigration debate, you'll find that HB2s, which technically are usually for folks in the technical field, you'll find a lot of tech liberals that are like, "Oh, we need less of those," and not that these people on those visas need rights and wages. Is that they'll argue that we just need less of them driving down our wages. And so I think you'll see this kind of, and rather than criminalize the corporations that are doing it, they'd rather just, take away the legal avenues that these workers have to get these jobs that they may say they're not performing as well as their American counterparts. But the businesses,
and then they'll become the bad immigrants, by the way.
Right, exactly.
Then they become quote unquote bad immigrants.
And it's nonsensical as well. As there's Jessica's Law, which came around, which also had essentially the solution to immigrants that were coming across the border was to lock them in prisons so that they stayed in this country, and we paid upwards of $50,000 a year to maintain them, but in deplorable conditions that are basically inhumane and probably don't even meet Geneva Convention expectations at this point. And so our whole kind of conceptualization, and we saw also in the Democratic debate with, well, is it still going to be a crime, or, is it a civil penalty, and is a civil penalty still a crime? What does that mean? It's like this necessity to criminalize the other, and as well as then to kind of disappear communities that don't fit into the narratives that they want, or that overlap, their identities overlap into several categories and are essentially erased in the generic or the kind of lumping together of these issues. And so I think those are all great points to raise.
Yeah. Speaking of points, I'm going to switch it over now back to Ms. Davis. But it's still fitting because we're now going to switch over and talk about identity politics, which I think is applicable here because it also, again, plays into this idea of whose voice is valid to be, loud enough to speak for certain groups and why. And also, what does it mean to kind of have tokenized members of said community be the ones doing the dirty work against their own community, right? And I think we definitely see that in the case of Trump's administration. But as Davis discusses, because she's talking about the Bush administration, there's a very long-held precedent of this misuse of identity, unfortunately, in a way that's craven and that's harmful to the communities that it claims to be representative of. So she brings up, this is around page 22, although she talks about it throughout, but she starts discussing this idea that basically, Dr. King, before he died, realized that the civil rights movement didn't go far enough in terms of breaking down not just the idea of yes, Black people need rights, but also that there's a necessity for Black people to be, to sort of recognize the limits of that power once we get it, right? And what that means. And she talks about the fact that, the idea was for some people that if you just put enough Black people in a certain position, if you put enough women in a certain position, or if you put, if you give people quote unquote access, then things will be better, right? And she says, quote, "The challenge of the 21st century is not to demand equal opportunity to participate in the machinery of oppression. Rather, it is to identify and dismantle those structures in which racism continues to be embedded. This is the only way the promise of freedom can be extended to the masses of people." And I think this is really important. It's not something new that we haven't talked about before, not only on this podcast, but just in general. I think right now this discussion of The misuse of identity politics is pretty, like, it's on everyone's lips in a lot of ways, although I think sometimes in ways that instead of addressing the misuse, people incorrectly assume that all identity politics are bad, and that's not what she's saying, and that's not what like people who really understand what identity politics means and its origins are saying. But the issue is that it's this idea that, like, as long as we have people who look like us in the seats of power, then it's fine. But the problem is that there's not a deep enough interrogation of what that power means and how it affects us and like other communities.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always Fred Hampton and the clip on the importance of education in movement, and how essentially that if we don't learn about what we're doing and why we're doing it, then essentially we end up with what he or what he says is Negro imperialists. And so I think that kind of leads us to where we're going to end up. But to me, that's the encapsulation of it, and to know that it was expressed then, and to know that we should have been continuing to build on it. And I think Davis does so here in this piece, or in the pieces that are collected here, but that it does not necessarily resonate with enough, or with everybody of the left. And I think that you also raised an interesting or critical point as far as kind of a delineation from I want to say, a critical analysis of identity politics and its role in modern politics, and essentially people that are just kind of dismissing it outright because of a co-option and a poisoning of it by a neoliberal factions that have kind of adopted some aspects of it in ways that I think are destructive. And then we see a kind of a counter narrative that emerges among leftists that are somewhat kind of, I don't know what the words I'm wanting to use here, but I guess narrow in their understanding of the movement and liberation of oppressed peoples worldwide, and kind of take a more Eurocentric perspective that, based off of a lot of older texts of leftist movements, don't really focus on the aspects of race and how race plays a role, particularly through a lens of the modern U.S. political environment. While Marx and Lenin had some very important and valuable things that we constantly reference, even in this particular piece, it starts out with Lenin's quote on prisons being the schools of revolutionaries. They also lacked a perspective that can only be gained through experience, but is not, and I'll take a quote from the text here, is that particular individuals are not inevitably linked to the structures of oppression implied by their racial backgrounds. So what Angela, I see, is saying there, and I have it on roughly page 67 of my digital copy, after the question about Condoleezza Rice and Alberto Gonzalez and Colin Powell, but essentially the point being that your identity is not an immunization towards politics of oppression towards that identity. And I think that is a critical observation that needs to be both interrogated and then integrated into anybody's view that wants to associate with themselves with the left, is that identity gives you perspective, but it's not an immunization against oppressive politics towards that identity.
And it's frustrating because I do think so. With going back quickly to Marx and Lenin, I mean, even their stuff touches on, some of Marx's stuff talks about slavery. Lenin, I know, has discussed and been utilized quite frequently by revolutionaries of color around the world against colonialism. So it's not like, what's frustrating is that even those thinkers are sort of put into this category of like class reductionists, and they're not actually.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm saying in general, I think some people assign them to that position when they too are also critical of the ways that like certain norms of classism kind of end up being replicated through these other forms, or not just replicated, but like deepened, I guess, further deepened and problematized by these other vectors of difference. And it reminds me too, like I'm not going to call him by name, but I see someone who's like an intellectual that I once very much admired, but I think has taken a very strange turn as of late, who's still writing in a way to deny that race plays a role in the way classism operates in this country. And I think it's a really dangerous track to take, because the reality is there's countless bits of evidence over and over, research studies, and it's almost like at this point being a climate change denier, or like you think the world is flat. Because honestly, if you look around and you look at the numbers and you look at the way classism operates in the United States and in many multiracial countries, or multi-ethnic countries, which is like all of them, but still, you get what I'm saying. Like the way it kind of breaks down, there are going to be often women, people of color, or people of certain religious minority groups, or even certain ethnicities and nationalities, they may experience and usually experience, inequality in different ways, or economic inequality in like more acute ways than their peers who may be of the quote unquote majority. So I don't know, it's a very strange form of denialism that I don't understand the point of, other than to aid white supremacy.
Right. And one way that I see that it manifests, and that I find to be kind of a succinct way to kind of confront it and present the contradiction, is that when you, like, if you ask what measurable improvements have been made to reduce the gap between Black and white people in this country, you find out that when you look, essentially the only improvements that you'll see, measurable improvements that you can see represented in the statistics, is representation.
Mm-hmm. And exceptional representation too. Like these are exceptions to the rule,
Absolutely.
It's like an Obama or a Condoleezza Rice, as Davis points out.
And I think, and we'll get more into it, it's very important to recognize why it is these exceptions are allowed or are integrated into the system, and what they represent to the system. Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes a critical role in also kind of our critique of Davis that we'll get to a bit later.
Oh, sure. Yes. I'm laughing just because I know what's coming. But there's another part that I wanted to just touch on, but it's very much related to this discussion. It's like an extension of the identity politics or misuse of identity politics discussion, where she talks about feminism and its failures, or at least mainstream bourgeois feminism, predominantly white feminism, and its failures with regard to Abu Ghraib and all of that, the sort of shock and surprise that the women were also engaged in torture of people, and that sort of the mask had fallen on this idea of supposed female unity or whatever, or the prospect of female unity. And I think that this is around in the 40s, mid 40s of the discussion where she talks about this. But she mentions that, what happens, unfortunately, is that now for all of us, we quote, we all have been offered an equal opportunity to perpetuate male dominance and racism. And as she further argues, violence and things like that. I don't know if I would characterize them as solely male, because she uses the term male in this way, but I don't think she's using it in like a literal way. I think she's kind of just using like feminist rhetoric language to kind of frame it in that way. But it reminds me, like this morning, I was listening to an interview on, like a morning talk show or whatever, and they were interviewing a woman and her husband who are like screenwriters or something, and they've created this new Netflix film about a rape victim and the police that investigate it. And one of the things that one of the authors mentioned was that, if there were more women involved in police investigations, then they would most likely be more empathetic and more thorough and things like that. And it's like, and she's white. And I just I said to myself, like, how in this day and age, where we literally, as she's saying this, there's a white woman on trial who shot a Black man in his own house and then was just like, I was distracted and didn't know. And because she thought he was intruding on her property and it was his property. Do you remember this case? She's like on trial right now. And I just said to myself, like, and then there've been like multiple cases of predominantly white female police officers engaging in incredibly violent behavior towards people of color. and particularly Black people. And I'm just sitting here thinking to myself, like, how can you say that? Like, how? And I don't know. It was jarring because it's like these two things are happening simultaneously, and we still have people who believe that just by virtue of some police people being women or of color or whatever, that the system itself is going to be somehow made better and more fair and better for like the general population. And like, which people are you talking about them expressing empathy towards and like being thorough in the investigations of? Because it sure as hell ain't us. Like, even when you think about like the Central Park Five, and the prosecutor in that case was a woman, and she was like pushing for the death penalty for these boys, you know? So there's really just I get frustrated with the fact that like some people, not everybody, but some people cannot see the dangers in these kinds of this kind of shorthand that's supposed to be about equality and whatever, when in actuality just sort of reinforces the really negative norms that we've become accustomed to.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I'm reminded of Ice Cube, the black cop showing out for the white cop. So
Right.
like, I'm reminded just, that a lot of observations that we make contemporarily or based on our circumstances are observations or recognitions that have existed in the past. And like, one of the things that's disturbing is that then the people that are doing these haven't corrected or even improved their strategies in ways that would make it less observable or noticeable. It's really just a lot of the times the same thing over again. And we see it in a lot of the rhetoric around a lot of these struggles, where essentially people are literally repeating the same racist tropes that were used 50, 60 years ago, and then again 100, 150 years ago, and virtually verbatim, even sometimes not even or like updating them for the current English usage of the words.
Right.
And so it's
Can you give us an example, like, so people know exactly what you mean?
it's just I mean, some of the ones that come to mind, like the one that's probably reasonably fresh in people's minds is Joe Biden at the debate, and essentially how Black families need to be taught how to raise their children, essentially.
Yeah.
And
Where's your record player, Richard?
Yeah, like, and again, literally using the record player reference, not updating for the current times. Although, with consideration, vinyls did outsell CDs recently, so
Nice.
just want to acknowledge that happened. So, but I think one of the things about the identity aspect that is really important that she mentions in the text is, I'll quote it here, is, quote, "Identity by itself has never been an adequate criterion around which communities of struggle could be organized, not even during those periods when we imagined identity as the most powerful engine of movements." She goes on to say, "Communities are always political projects that can never solely rely on identity." And I think that's her picking up, and also building on what Wendy was saying about how the idea that these identities and unity around identity will provide liberation is a mistaken notion, and we see it play out with as Wendy mentions, the police officers, and we can see it as is mentioned in the text with the Condoleezza Rices, the Colin Powells, the Alberto Gonzalez, and others, and that if you organize strictly around identity, you're going to be confronted with these types of issues. But when organizing around a political kind of theory and center, that's avoidable, particularly when that political identity and center has a recognition of the value of all people in an international perspective, as well as one that's aware of the unique positions that various identities put people in within the struggle. And so I think that's a critical component, particularly also in the kind of feeling of Du Bois and building a positive kind of replacement, is these organizations that replace the kind of democracy that we know now run mostly by oligarchs, is it recognizes the various identities, and it also recognizes that the identities in themselves aren't organizational or aren't something that can be organized by themselves, but that the politics that come along with those identities. So, if it's disabled people, the rights and recognitions that come along with that, or trans rights, or whatever the issue may be, that it has to be placed within a greater socialist struggle and an internationalist perspective that takes into consideration the struggles that we are all facing, and that doesn't uniquely focus on identities to the detriment of the class identities that bind the political struggle.
Right. And not just like the class identities, but also the way that that's lived, right? I mean, it's not just because generally sometimes people argue that like class is not an identity, right? It's like a state of being in many ways. And I think that there is, we have to be careful as well, like to understand that it's not just about like, oh, I'm poor, but it's like, how is poor being lived, right? What does that mean? So it's not just like an identity, like you check a box, I'm poor, I'm rich or whatever, but it's like your day-to-day life takes on a different shape by virtue of your economic status. And oftentimes that economic status is linked to like your basic opportunities and, like things that I think sometimes we don't think about because we tend to see class in the US as a kind of temporary misfortune as opposed to something that can be generational and can be sustained by the systems that exist,
Yeah, I think it's important, the systemic analysis versus the individual analysis that you highlight there. Like, I think that's a very important point that I just want to clarify, but I agree with fully.
No. I mean, I wasn't saying that to be like, Richard, you're wrong. But it was just like, it's a thing that I picked up on because I think it's like, I think even that framing, as innocent as it is one that sometimes we make a mistake of like, it sort of lightens the load, if you will, right? And I would argue too that even ethnic and racial identity too is something that it's not just an identity in some ways. You know what I mean? Like I think identity, calling things an identity sometimes cheapens what they mean in the day to day, to a degree. I mean, that's not something that I've heard someone say. I'm just thinking in general, right? Like offhand right now. What does it mean to live as a Black person versus just like checking a box and identifying as a Black person? I think are two different things. And I think like class analysis and historical analysis helps us better understand what it means to say something like that, which I think Davis does really well. There was one more part I just wanted to add of hers, and then we can switch over to talking about some criticism of hers, of Davis, that I think is pretty important. There is something on page 24 that, again, kind of relates back to this discussion that we're having about the misuse of identity politics, but also I think ties in some of the stuff that you were bringing in just now about internationalism and the importance of like connecting to international communities and solidarity, and understanding why people are living in the conditions that they are, and that it's not just like some fluke accident, and that we have to kind of learn to make connections and recognize the world beyond ourselves. She says on page 24 that, quote, it's sort of at the end, but she says, it's true that in the US, among Black people who are used to being the quote unquote super minority, we must let go of this claim. There is this prevalent idea that because Black people established the historical anti-racist agenda for the United States of America, they will always remain its most passionate advocates. But Black people as a collective cannot live on the laurels of its historical past, which again will connect us to what we're about to discuss with regard to criticism of Davis. She continues, we've recently received harsh lessons about conservative possibilities in Black communities. Quote unquote Black cannot simply be considered an uncontestable synonym of progressive politics. So basically, and this is something that like Sharice Burden-Stelly said in our like one of my earliest interviews for this podcast. Go back and listen to it if you haven't. But she talks about this fact that like sometimes for some people, the idea of Blackness in and of itself is radical. And that's not necessarily how this always plays out, right? We have to be careful not to essentialize as well. And I think that, this is why sometimes phrases like listen to Black women can frustrate me, because it's very select, like which Black women, like not all Black women are radical, and some Black women perpetuate systems that harm other Black women. So I think we have to be really careful with our understanding of what certain identities signify versus what those people, like people within that identity have. We're not a monolith is what I'm trying to say. And I think that some people don't have our best intentions in mind, and some people are engaging in harmful practices within the community. And we have to recognize that as well when we kind of create this shorthand. And I think in large, it's like, it's Twitter, so whatever, or like social media, it's something you can put on a t-shirt or in a tweet. But I think it's important for us to like understand that these kinds of seemingly liberatory or like like positively reinforcing phrases can also be harmful because they ignore the difference within the community, and they also ignore the fact that not all Black people are right all the time, not all women are right all the time. And some of those people should be criticized. And I think, unfortunately, that kind of language is weaponized and then used against those of us who are critical of, say, some Black women who engage in these harmful practices. I've seen it with my own eyes in very recent days, where I think there is a disconnect as well with regard to what Black people in America understand as oppression and Blackness, and sometimes our inability. And I say this as a Black person, so I'm not, like, let me use identity politics, right? As a Black person, as a Black woman, I also recognize that some Black women don't fully understand what it means to be in solidarity with Black women throughout the diaspora. I think there's still a limitation on us because we live in the United States. And I think sometimes we still, I saw it today, like watching TV, there are people who work for the CIA who are Black. So like, it doesn't necessarily mean that just by virtue of being Black or just by virtue of being female, that there's some sort of automatic registration of like Black solidarity in its fullest extent. I don't know. I don't think that we should be so reliant on these things, and we have to be more critical when we see people failing at it, to be honest. Like, if we're going to say things like listen to Black women, we also have to be critical of Black women when they fail at being real in full solidarity with other Black women, because let's say they're of a different class or of a different nationality or whatever. We have to be willing to point that out and hold each other accountable as well. And about accountability, let's switch over to Miss Davis herself, which
yeah. Before we go in that, I just wanted to mention that one of the key kind of takeaways that I pulled away from this text and our readings up to this point in general and just experience is that one thing that we have to recognize is that liberation is going to be criminalized. Like those two things, getting liberated and being free is going to be criminalized by a system that is dependent on that not happening. So I think that's part of the failing of Douglass and the importance of Du Bois, and then of Davis, and that the recognition that this criminalization, the carcerality, and this punitive mentality has on the future of liberation, in that liberation is going to run up against those struggles, and it's going to be imprisoned, it's going to be shackled, it's going to be forced to labor in the interest of white supremacy. Those are things that we can expect, and they shouldn't be viewed as, I guess, reasons not to pursue liberation, or that a particular path towards liberation is not righteous because it's criminal. It's like, well, all paths that actually lead to liberation will be criminalized if they aren't already, and so that's just a reality that we're going to have to deal with. And so we're going to have to integrate that and incorporate that into any plans towards both organization, building struggles and movements together, and so on and so forth, and the risks that are involved as well.
Right.
Which I think also kind of plays into Davis's history and experience. And I'll let you give us a bit of an intro.
Oh no, I agree. I mean, it absolutely does. So sadly, I mean, there's always this turn, right? At the end of reading Revolution, we're like, well, all that good stuff we said about the author, let's take a pause on that. There's always this kind of like weird side, not weird, but just like, again, people are fallible, right? Like, people make mistakes, people are flawed, they're not perfect. This is why, people always say, like, don't, like, even the people you love and like your heroes are not perfect. So like, don't hook your horse to them and expect them to be, always be the person you imagined in your head. There's a better, quicker phrase about this that I'm forgetting right now, but but I just think that there's I think it's like even your faves are problematic, right? I think in this case, we have a case of like our fave, Angela Davis, being problematic. So there was an article written in Black Agenda Report, which is a left-leaning Black site on the internet. And it's written by Margaret Kimberly. She's an editor there at BAR, and she wrote an article called "Ignoring Angela Davis," which is like, well, their titles at Black Agenda Report are always very like out there. But I think this particular article is important. It raises some important points about Angela Davis's sort of foray into electoral politics and what that means. And I don't mean her explicit like run, because she ran for the Communist Party in the 80s. But in this case, the way that she talks about electoral politics in the US and Margot Kimberly's criticism thereof, which I think is fairly valid. So at some point, I guess during the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running against one another, Davis, I'm assuming this was well after the primaries and all of that, but she said, "I'm not so narcissistic to say that I wouldn't vote for her," meaning Hillary Clinton in this case, I guess, when she was asked about her feelings on the election. And I recall this. I think she said it on Democracy Now! Or something like that. But Margot Kimberly also, in this article and in several other articles as well, there's more than just one at BAR that's critical of Davis. But she talks about the fact that Davis endorsed Obama in both 2008 and 2012. And she says, Margot Kimberly says, quote, "She not only supported him again in 2012, but claimed that he was part of the, quote, Black radical tradition. The lie is so grotesque that it is difficult to know if she was really thinking when she said those words. Nor was this her first foolish remark uttered on behalf of Obama." And so then she says that Davis said in 2010 that, quote, "Obama won despite the power of money." And so I think that these are valid criticisms of her, especially considering her radical past and all of her radical writings and things like that. It seems a bit uncharacteristic of her that she would be in such support of Obama, especially considering her criticism of identity politics or the way that they're misused, and like her failure, it seems, to recognize the problems with Obama, especially on foreign policy, but even some of his rhetoric on the domestic front towards other Black people that was incredibly, negative. So yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? I feel like I'm on Kimberly's side, Margot Kimberly's side here. But what are your thoughts about this article and maybe some of the criticism of her connection to electoral, or her opinions of electoral politics here?
I guess before I do that, I just want to say that, Davis's like history and work is like, I barely have any room or reason to criticize or anything other than from a theoretical perspective, from as, backing in the sense of being critically analyzing what I'm taking in from her. Her work and her efforts have been, basically unparalleled by anything I've done or probably ever will do. And so I don't want to take away anything from a radical struggle. The FBI never locked me up in a prison cell, and I didn't have to think about what that was like, or what would happen the next time the FBI wanted to talk to me, or if they were going to talk. I don't have to think about any of that stuff like in the ways that she does. So
you're not canceling Angela Davis, is what you're saying.
That's not what I'm doing. But at the same time, wow, the juxtaposition of what she says about Obama and reading this, it's like it feels like either a large amount of money or a threat had to change hands in order to have this kind of difference in opinion. And considering this text isn't that old, it references Abu Ghraib and the Bush administration. So this isn't, this is back in her radical days kind of thing. It's like, no, it was
in 2005, I believe.
Yeah. It just proceeded when Obama really was seriously looking like he was going to be the president of the United States, or had a chance anyway. And so the rapid change is what is really jarring to me, that really stuck out, is that what she says about Obama and how she treats the elections with Obama and then going on to Clinton is in such radical, incongruity with what she writes here. And the way she talks about Obama also seems less sincere and is less thoroughly kind of backed up and rooted in kind of her politics, and more in an observation of contemporary times and very kind of localized around the very specific circumstances of the Democratic nominee versus the Republican nominee, which prior to this time, she mentioned she voted Green or whatever, and so on and so forth. That Obama was the first time that she voted for either major party candidate, is what she says in the text. And so like in the article, and so like it's very interesting to me and very jarring, like I said, to see the kind of difference there. And I think one of the aspects that I think was kind of key was this kind of idea that I think a lot of Black people had at the time, which was weighing, that Obama might not be representative of the politics that I want, but represented the identity argument and made something real that didn't exist before, and which was the idea that the United States could elect a Black president.
Mm-hmm.
But she missed the part about, well, what politics did he have to have in order to do that? And we find that it was a reinforcement of white supremacy and the co-option of that identity, which rises to that position. And Davis is in a position and has the capabilities to make that critique, and she didn't at the time when it was probably most needed, and that is disheartening. And so I think we're going to talk about the critique of Davis itself. I think we should also kind of talk about what it means to the movement in general to be a radical that lives past the times when radicals typically exist, past their 40s or whatever. Is like, what does that mean to your politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like in her text, actually in the text that we read, she says that like Black people can't rest on the laurels of the civil rights movement, and we can't like be so focused on the sort of figures of the past that we ignore what's happening in the present. And I think that can also be applied to Davis or just radical thinkers in general, because at some point is there an expiration date, like to their radicalism?
Look, if we look at like between the folks, is like we got her, and then we got Bobby Rush, and we got Conyers, and we got Elijah Cummings. Is like between them, she's the most righteous and the most true to her radical politics, clearly. So, but like it does seem that there's a trend from the living members of the civil rights movements that weren't incarcerated or killed or completely marginalized off the political scene, that there's a demarcated or a demonstrated
demarcation
of their radical beliefs.
Yeah, and maybe it's that they survived decline. Or whatever that kind of. I mean, I hate to say this, but like maybe it's because they were physically threatened, but they survived it. And so maybe that taught them their lesson of gotta appeal to the, I don't know. I mean, what I'm saying is kind of scary because I'm like, is it that they were just like scared out of being radical?
Yeah. Another aspect of it is that the polling showed, Obama had something like 95% approval among Black people. So it was hard to be Black and oppose Obama during the height of 2008. But yeah, and some people did it. And as a radical, it would seem to be most fitting. But again, perhaps some of the lived experience of being, on tour, speaking at colleges is a little different than being deeply immersed into the radical Black movement on the ground and the kind of confrontations between the forces of white supremacy and the people on the streets, rather than kind of more in the academic atmosphere. I don't know, perhaps that plays a role.
Maybe, but I think the big difference for me is that like I think supporting Obama in 2008 is one thing, but then supporting him again in 2012, once you had a full record of what was going on, is not good. Like that's when it's kind of like, okay, like what he's said and done by that point. You had 4 years to kind of think about it and recognize for what it is. And I mean, and I'm saying this as someone, I voted for him in 2012. I was not as radical in 2012 either, but I think for someone like her, if I had read her text, if I had read Abolition Democracy in 2012 or 2008 and then looked at Obama and some of the things he did while in office, I would be like, wait, how is he different from like on certain policies? How is he different from a Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice? How is he not fulfilling kind of like the things that she talks about in this text? I don't know. And I also, I remember during the 2016 election, she was on Democracy Now! And she was asked, about whether or not she supported Bernie or Hillary, and she said she didn't want to get involved, and she didn't want to, like, she was like, I don't endorse candidates really. And then during the election, once it got to the general, she said what she said, which we already mentioned. But then I remember she also spoke at the Women's March. So right after Trump was elected, she spoke there alongside lots of bourgeois neoliberal type feminists. So it was kind of weird. And I think that I don't know, maybe this is where she's most comfortable right now. And I think she might be playing in some ways kind of like an inside outside game. So maybe she's on the inside trying to use her position of power, whatever, however you want to interpret that, but her access in a way to try to radicalize people. But at the same time, I don't know how useful that is, because I also recognize that, like, people see Angela Davis as a symbol more than they actually take her for her word in many cases. So, like, I'll see people with Angela Davis t-shirts and Angela Davis as their backdrop on social media, but then they'll be spewing stuff that's like totally centrist, capitalist driven, whatever. I don't know how deeply they've read or even understand what she stood for at one point. And part of me wonders if her own involvement in some of these spaces helps aid that process of de-radicalization of her own message.
Oh, that's I hadn't really thought about that, but that is actually a good point about how essentially, I mean, I know if I were a more centrist, liberal-leaning person, and then I had Angela Davis saying something to that effect, to be like, okay, well, if this radical can bring herself to vote for this person, then I guess it can't be that bad for me. But
right.
With context of the last essentially, I guess, 12 years of her politics, give or take, it's it doesn't, like, her last 12 years of politics, and outside of specifically her abolition stuff, like for abolishing prisons, outside of that, it doesn't match up with her radical past. When she's strictly talking about abolishing prisons outside of presidential politics and so forth, then I think it's still, like, a lot of her rhetoric still matches, and her message matches her historical kind of positions. But when it comes to the presidential politics, they simply just don't match up. I don't find, I like, having looked through both what she said in justification of it and just general, I found a Root article that kind of was more forgiving of her than the Black Agenda Report article. And even reading through all of that, I'm not seeing any sort of real rationalization or justification based on any sort of real theory, or based in any radical tradition or anything like that. It's essentially just acquiescing to the two-party system and kind of trying to make it not feel as bad. That's what I see, and it's unfortunate, and I can't I can't be inside of her head and understand exactly why it's there. And like you said, there's an inside outside thing. And one of the things that came to my mind when I was trying to kind of put all this in my, like, trying to synthesize and integrate this into my understanding, both with Davis, and then this prompted me to look more into like Bobby Rush, and it's like he came out and endorsed Kamala Harris, and it's just like, wait, like, what? Like, how does a Bobby Rush, what happens in life that leads to the? And then I look back to Chicago, and then to also, like, his history, and find out, oh, okay, well, this is kind of what happened and where it happened. He became a part of the white power structure and saw significant professional improvements as a result. And then you see, the Bill Clinton and the crime bill, and how that's justified through the NAACP, and you see how, oh, okay, I see how after the radical movements of the 60s and into the 70s, there was this co-option and deletion. It's like, obviously, a lot of the most radical people were killed off or imprisoned, and the next tier were integrated into the system and bought off, and another group was marginalized and just cast off the political scene as much as could be possible. And so what it seems to me is that essentially, if you're a black radical from the 60s that's managed to maintain a public profile, it's come at a cost of sacrificing some of your more radical beliefs. And like, and whether that's just a rhetorical thing or it's a sincere thing that exists deep in the beliefs, I can't speak to, but that is a trend that I see when I look at a lot of the black radicals that have maintained a prolific public profile.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just specific to Black radicals in the US. I mean, I can think of so many examples just like off the top of my head right now of like what happened in post-colonial African countries. You know, like after the liberation movement, so many leaders were killed either during the decolonization process or shortly after. And then the people who took over were basically like neoliberal, you know, lapdogs to Europe and the US, and were used, you know, and in some ways, some of the ones who survived, who were part of these movements, used, much like Black radicals in the US, used the specter of their history as radicals to then give them legitimacy among the communities and among voters. But in actuality, they were, you know, placating these sources of power. And I it's frustrating because I agree with you on like on Bobby Rush. He's even said he has a history of saying like anti-communist stuff. Even Davis said some stuff on Russiagate. And then I remember as well, there's another Black woman who was in the Panthers. I can't remember her name right now, but she is an ardent Harris supporter. And it's just like, am I, what? You know, like it's always really jarring because you're not expecting it. You want a kernel of the person that person used to be there still. And sometimes it's just not. And I think sometimes it's the image. It's like, you know, okay, I used to be a Black Panther. I used to do this and that, and that's cool. And sometimes I say things that sound inspiring or radical or whatever. But when it comes time for me to act, I'm sitting on my hands, you know, or I'm endorsing somebody who I know. I mean, I almost am just like, how can you look at her record and say those things unless someone is, I don't know. I mean, because I don't want to say they're manipulated. I think it's just like, again, a sort of appeal to perhaps identity, like they want to see a Black woman president, or I don't know, but I can't understand how someone who, if Kamala Harris were alive and practicing law, I should say, at the time that they were all radicals, all their asses would be in jail under her prosecutorial record. So like, or her prosecutorial tenure. So like, what is going on? Like, what explains this disconnect? And I really don't know. Like I again, we cannot in their heads. We don't know the full answer to this. There's just, you can just guess, but it is frustrating to watch, to say the least. And I don't know. It's very disappointing. It's really saddening actually, because I think there's a part of us that wants to hold on to that so we can like have some sort of inspiration in the present, you know. But then if we pay attention to what they're doing now, it almost like makes you lose hope, because you're like, fuck, like are all the radicals going to end up like that in 10 years or 5 years or 20 years from now, you know?
I mean, it's hard. It's a bit disheartening, and it's hard to get through this struggle and see the light at the end of the tunnel in a lot of ways. And so when some of the like most ardent and strident fighters for liberation, you see them kind of taking this role on of essentially, you know, backing these kind of either politicians or policies that are so counterproductive towards liberation. It's just like, one, I don't never want that to be me. I'm reminded of a stickman, or not a stickman, but a line from there's a "Which Side Are You On" remix with Dead Prez on it, and one of the lines is like essentially like talks about, you know, being Fred Hampton, if I ever forget, or it says basically, please blow my brains out if I ever forget. And it's like, I feel that line, and that like how Hampton died, the kind of the radical tradition and beliefs that he held when he died are the kind that I want to maintain until I'm gone. I don't want to find myself like, I already voted for Obama. I don't want to go back to that. Like,
You don't want to revert.
Yeah, I don't want that. It's like I liberation and understanding liberation is a ongoing struggle for me, and the last thing I want is for all that work to land me where I started. And so like when I see somebody like Angela Davis end up there, and I look to someone like Hampton, I just wonder, had he been alive today, or MLK was also becoming more radical towards the end of his life, where would they have ended up? Would they be over here with me critiquing Angela Davis's more recent political positions, or would they be with Angela Davis explaining to me how, as a young blood, I need to understand how this all works, you know? and it's I don't know. And so then it makes me think about where are this generation of leaders, where are they now, and then where are they going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now, especially with recognition and consideration for the circumstances that we're going to be facing in that timeline with climate.
And co-opting actually happens much faster now, thanks to, I think, just the reach of power. To be honest, like I think institutions of power have much can reach people much faster now. You don't have to go through their CIA file or whatever. You can just like slide into their DMs. And I think that it's very obvious when we look to some of the people who were in Black Lives Matter, like Black Lives Matter leadership, who very quickly went to the other side, if you will. They're not like supporting police, but I think that they're supporting, in some cases, measures that hurt the Black community, or that they're making money, but they're not really helping people. And I know for a fact that like some people who were involved in Black Lives Matter in some capacity or another of leadership support Kamala Harris. So that, again, and that was just a couple years ago. I mean, it wasn't like Black Lives Matter was 20 years ago. It was a few years ago. Like when that exploded, you know what I mean? When Ferguson and Baltimore and all these things kind of came out on the world stage as sites of resistance. And a lot of those people fell off and are doing all sorts of stuff now that we wouldn't look at and praise.
Yeah, and we were remiss to not mention that several protesters from the Ferguson movement are also found dead under mysterious circumstances. And so, a lot of people will attribute, any sort of association to that with the powers of repression, but the precedent is there. So I don't consider it paranoia, but a reasonable, if not presumption, at least a reasonable potential explanation.
Right. Well, I don't know. I guess all we can do is hope that we can keep moving in a progressive, more radical direction ourselves, and whatever other people do is whatever they do. But I don't know. I don't want to end this on such a negative note, but
I mean, I think again, Hampton, is like live for the people, or struggle for the people, live for the people, die for the people. And it's like, I feel like, someone like Angela Davis has to have died a little inside when she was saying some of those things. She felt it. Like, I believe it.
We don't know that, though. We don't even know that, because I don't think we know that, because she did the same thing with Clinton. I don't know if we know that.
I want to believe.
I think she's all right, but I don't know. I can't speak for her, so I don't know what's going on. But
maybe we'll be so lucky to one day be able to ask her some of these questions.
I don't think after what I've said that she's gonna ask anything. But
maybe we'll find her at a campus where it's a little harder to run away from us.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, she does do so much public speaking that it could be a possibility that, like, if I ever go to one of her talks and I'm honored with the possibility of asking questions, I can ask her about that. Like, can you please explain, some of your decisions during elections? Like, how does that square with how can we reconcile that with some of the things you said even during this speech today? And then I'll get carted off by the police or something. But
yeah, I'd like to think that I have that revolutionary spirit, but I would probably just be all starry-eyed and ask for an autograph or something.
I wouldn't be afraid to ask her, but the issue is that, of course, usually when you go to these things, people who ask questions are very laudatory. They don't criticize. It's seen as kind of sacrilege. Like, you're not supposed to do that. But I think that's the point, right? Like, older Angela Davis back in the 70s wouldn't have been afraid to ask those kinds of questions of people with power. So
she'd have yelled it before they got done doing their little intro talk.
Yeah, so I'm just continuing her tradition from the past. Right. But we'll see. But if I ever have the opportunity, I will definitely ask her about this. And I'm sure I don't know. It's possible that people have never asked her. They might have written about it and criticized her, but I'm not sure if if anyone has ever asked her personally, like on the record.
I mean, when you're somebody like that, it's possible to avoid a criticism like that and just be completely oblivious to it. As far as that people are, putting that out there, it's something that is, and she's not on Twitter, so that's another aspect too. It's very possible that she didn't recognize the kind of pushback that she got, or didn't have to really confront it in any personal way.
And she's surrounded by people who would be okay with it. Like, I don't think that she's surrounded by people who would kind of take her to task by that necessarily. If she's involved. She's still in, she's like making speeches and doing academic stuff. But I think as you sort of hinted at earlier, it's still a sort of insulated existence, if you will. I mean, I don't, that sounds bad, but like insulated in the sense that it's not quite the same engagement that she had when she was younger, which I understand. I mean, this is what happens, right? You don't need to be in the trenches your whole life necessarily. But I do wonder if that sort of insulation, I should say, kind of keeps her from being as critical even of her own thoughts, because she's not openly criticized in those environments, because those people are just happy to have her. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Those people want her to be there and want to have a welcoming space. And I don't think you want to bite the hand that feeds you. You don't want to alienate your guests. You don't want to like alienate someone like her, which I understand. So I think that also kind of, I think that's what I mean when I was saying earlier, like, I think that also explains her transition, because I don't think anyone was willing to call her on the carpet for some of the stuff.
Right.
You know?
I don't know. And one of the questions that I find myself leaving with is do revolutionaries get to retire? Or is that an option? Is that a fair, like, can you be like, oh, I spent 40 years in the struggle, now I'm going to secure my personal security, if that means signing up for neoliberal stuff so I can get a paycheck, then that's that. Like, is that something that's reasonable, or is it, nope, you got to die revolutionary, and that's just the way it is?
Du Bois might say that she pulled the Douglas. Anyway, on that note, we got to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Richard, for being here as always. Thank you to all of our listeners and patrons on Patreon, and anyone who shares, likes, comments, whatever. Don't forget, by the way, y'all have got to leave comments and ratings on iTunes. We have a couple, but we need more, because the issue is, I know we have a lot of listeners, like, I know, because I see the numbers, but I don't see the ratings. So please, if you listen and like us, leave us a rating, because it helps other people find out about the podcast and, like, get involved in some way with whatever we're doing. So please do that if you haven't done so already. It's very easy. Just go and log into iTunes and follow the instructions to write a review or leave a star rating. Hopefully 5 stars, because you like us. And then, but that's all. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy, as always, and good luck, everyone.
And thank you for listening to the Left Pocket Project podcast. Once again, don't forget to find us on social media, and that's always at LeftPOC, LEFTPOC. To give us a rating and review on iTunes, and to be sure to check out our Patreon page, where you can make a donation and peruse all of our free content. Thanks again, and have a good one.